We looked at verses 26 through 27. And we learned, as Paul said, we all have a weakness. And what was the weakness that Paul, including himself, said we all have? Our weakness is we do not know what we ought to pray for. And Paul included himself. That's what we learned. We learned that we need the Holy Spirit as a prayer partner. And if you don't have the Holy Spirit as a prayer partner, you may be praying things that you should not be praying at all. You may be praying in ignorance, Paul says. Paul says we're all lacking in that. We need the Holy Spirit to do our praying for us. Our text today comes right after these verses we've just studied. As a matter of fact, Romans 8 never was divided into verses, let alone a chapter. And so if there is one text that needs context for interpreting, folks, it is this one. Unfortunately, this text has been isolated all by itself and has been used to say something that the text was never intended to say. Because it has been taken out of the context of what Paul already has said. And if there is one text in the Bible that shows you must have context to understand it, folks, it is this text. Often this happens with texts of the Bible. That one text says the whole thing we say. There are a few texts that may do that, but folks, it's not often that any text in itself teaches without context of what went before and what went after. The only one I can think of, well, there's more. There's Proverbs, there's some Psalms. John 3:16, that's a text all by itself that pretty much says it, doesn't it? Encapsulates a message. But it is not Romans 8:28. You must remember the context. We need to be sure we know what we are professing and are not merely mouthing pious nothings. And that day in that hospital room, when this church lady wanted to say this, that came across as pious nothings. Because there was nothing good happening that day in that hospital room. When times are good, when we have steady jobs, when our families are doing well, when no loved one is sick, and there have been no recent deaths, in times like this, it is easy to say, we know that in all things God works together for the good of those who love Him. Easy to say then. But those words do come off as pious nothings to many who are affected by the hatred and evil in our world today. What is Paul saying when he says this? We can answer that by remembering what he has said before. And not only the 2 verses before, but the entire chapter before. You must understand the context of where he comes to at this point. What has he just said in the 2 verses before? He has just said we do not know what we ought to pray for. And he includes himself. Now he says we do know that God is working. We do not know, but we know. What's going on here, Paul? We don't know, but we know. The first knowing concerns the details of what God is doing in our lives. We do not understand these things. We puzzle over them. Ever been there? You don't understand some of the things going on in your life? This is what we don't know. That's the first. Paul says we don't know. Even to the fact we don't even know what to pray for. The second knowing concerns the fact of God's great plan itself. Paul tells us that we do know this. We do know God has a plan. So we don't know on one occasion what we ought to pray for, but we do know that God has a plan. But we often don't know that plan. See the conundrum there? God has a plan, but many times we don't know His plan. And some people will only accept God if they understand exactly what God's plan is for them. And Paul says, you're crazy. You can't know that. Many times you don't.